Chapter 1. Blood on the Sand. The dawn had passed, and as the new day took hold, its sunlight illuminated the majestic crowns of the giant trees. A summer breeze rustled through the fluffy branches, rippling the mirror-like waters of a stream running through the grass and rushing away, cooling the rocky cliffs of the gray mountain foothills that rose like an unbreakable wall to the east. Suddenly, a human figure flickered between the tree trunks in the forest. In an instant, a man burst from the thicket, glancing back as he ran. He was completely naked, save for a loincloth and wide copper bracelets on his wrists. His heaving chest was crossed by wide leather straps that secured a heavy, straight, two-handed sword to his back. Standing over 4 cubits tall and possessing a powerful build, the runner did not appear cumbersome or unwieldy. On the contrary, his every movement conveyed the lightness and grace of a hunting panther. After running about 30 cubits from the edge of the forest, he looked back, brushed a strand of long jet-black hair from his forehead, and peered into the green thicket. Finally, his steel-gray eyes flashed sternly as he spotted something, and 7 armed warriors in Praetorian Guard armor and tunics burst from the forest. The pursuers wore light steel helmets that concealed their blonde hair. Seeing the fugitive, the Praetorians shouted joyfully and spread out in a semicircle, gradually closing ranks. Even if the man felt trapped, he showed no sign of it. With a vicious grin, he drew the sword from his back, preparing to sell his life dearly. He knew his opponents were no cowards either. Many had fought on the Empire's borders, honing their skills in wars against the wild northern barbarians and in countless skirmishes in the mountainous passes of Thrace, where he was born. The legionnaires slowly approached the Thracian. One of them, clad in a gilded cuirass and helmet, raised his sword high. "Well, Bess," he shouted mockingly, "by Jupiter you've been caught. How do you plan to escape now, Thracian dog?" "Rest assured, Quintus," growled the Highlander. "I'll take a few of your soldiers with me to the afterlife, and maybe even you. Who's first?" Spurred on by the Thracian, Quintus's legionnaires rushed into battle. In an instant they surrounded him on all sides. "Thracian dog!" Quintus shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the furious roar of one of the legionnaires, who attacked Bess first. The Thracian dodged the blow, shifting slightly to the side, and then, with the speed of a snake strike, his blade cut through the legionnaire's block. The sharp, two-handed sword sliced upward from the Praetorian's groin, and with a scream of pain and horror, the warrior fell to the grass, soaking it with his blood. Leaping back from the flashing blade, Bess swung mid-air and slashed downward. Bone, flesh, and blood blended into a single bloody mass. The severed head of the legionnaire soared into the air, silencing his scream. Bess, meanwhile, did not stand still. Like a whirlwind, he darted among the attackers, sowing confusion and fear in their ranks. An arm raised above a head, clutching a sword, but it did not have time to descend. A flash of the silver blade, and severed at the elbow, it fell to the ground. The legionnaire, face pale, clutching the stump to his chest, collapsed to his knees, trying to stem the flow of blood gushing from the wound. Bess grinned a terrifying smile and brought his sword down on the next opponent's head. Crushing the helmet, the blade sank into the legionnaire's skull, bringing him to his knees. Flesh and gore splattered from under the steel. The Thracian himself remained unscathed, save for a few light cuts. Quintus, cursing, swung, but did not have time to strike. A piercing, sharp scream of terror threw him back from the Thracian. The battle instantly ceased. Bess stood, his blood-smeared blade lowered, and looked towards the forest, from where the heart-wrenching scream seemed to come. The Praetorians, hearing the cry, grew uneasy. "Hades take me," said Quintus, his voice trembling. "What was that?" "By Dis, it's coming from the beach." One of the legionnaires looked at Quintus. Could it be something with the galley? Suddenly, a shadow covered them from above, but before they could raise their eyes to the sky to see the figure casting it, another scream echoed, and a blood-soaked human body crashed down on them. "Mark!" exclaimed Quintus, rushing to the body lying on the ground. The Thracian, intrigued by the unusual events, approached closer. Despite the fall from a great height, the unfortunate man was still alive. He breathed heavily and raspily, his chest crushed so that bloodied ribs protruded. For a moment his gaze became lucid, and he saw Quintus bending over him. "Quintus," he rasped, spitting blood, "get out of here. If you want to live this island of demons cursed by the gods, run, for the curse will get you too." With these words, he died. The blood drained from his face. A spasm ran through his body, and Mark lay still forever. Quintus rose from his knees, and his blue eyes burned with vengeful fire. "By Jupiter, someone will pay for his death," he swore, placing his hand on the hilt of his sword. Bess looked at the corpse. The Thracian had been in many battles, each more bloodthirsty than the last, but never in his life had he seen such horrific wounds as those on Mark. The chest was horribly mangled. Arms and legs twisted at unnatural angles. It was impossible to believe that the creature lying before the Highlander had ever been human. "Thracian," Quintus's voice suddenly rang out, and Bess raised his head. "For your crimes against my people, you deserve death," so said Caesar. Quintus paused, weighing his words, then continued. "Mark was my blood brother, and saved me from death many times. If you help me find his killer on this thrice-cursed island, I give you my warrior's word that you will be free, and I will stop pursuing you. Do you agree?" Bess nodded silently and shook the outstretched hand, accepting the agreement. Suddenly the sound of battle and clashing blades came from the forest. Two tall men, desperately fighting off a horde of short, dark-skinned warriors dressed in colorful feathers, burst into the clearing. "By Mars, it's Vitus and Brutus," exclaimed one of the legionnaires. "And they're alive." "They won't last long," Bess noted. "Look, some of the natives are flanking them from the side. Soon they'll be encircled." "So why are we standing here?" cried the Praetorian. "We must help them." "And what about Titus?" "He's bleeding out," asked the second legionnaire, pointing his sword at the warrior Bess had crippled. Titus no longer moaned, but sat on the ground, whimpering quietly, clutching the stump to his chest, eyes rolling back. "Finish him," Quintus said dispassionately. The legionnaire shrugged and swung his naked sword. The decapitated body fell to the ground, convulsing in its final throes. Meanwhile, the two men were retreating under the assault of the dark-skinned warriors. Their path to the lake was strewn with the corpses of natives, but the enemy outnumbered them 10-1, and fatigue was setting in. Suddenly, Bess and 3 Romans charged into the throng of enemies. The Thracian excelled at annihilating the natives, wielding his sword with astonishing dexterity. His gray eyes flared with a demonic fire as an enemy fell under his blade. The Thracian was constantly in motion, presenting only a blurred shadow to his foes. His sword strokes invariably found their mark, striking down enemies left and right. Superstitious fear gripped the natives. In panic they fled, leaving their wounded and dead on the battlefield. In an instant, it was over. The entire clearing within 100 cubits was strewn with native corpses. Only then did Bess allow himself to catch his breath. He lowered his sword and leaned on it wearily, searching for his allies with his eyes. They were approaching him, surveying the clearing and looking at their handiwork. "You fought well, Thracian," Quintus said, approaching him. "If I were Caesar, I'd take you into my personal guard." "Yeah," Vitus, whom Bess knew from old times, sneered. "And you'd wake up in the morning to find your throat slit from ear to ear." Brutus, who followed behind, a tall, middle-aged Briton with a well-developed musculature, nodded in greeting to the Thracian. "I never thought I'd see you again, Bess." When Legate Quintus gathered the cohort, he only said we were chasing a runaway gladiator and his gang. "It's been a long time since we last saw each other." "Yes, it has," Bess nodded. "Since you sailed down the river, recruiting men for your pirate raids in our mountain villages. I didn't know that old enemies of the Empire now fight on its side." Brutus darkened. "About 3 years ago, my galley wrecked off the northwestern shores of the Empire. I and a few others were captured near the tip of the Grey Cape, and if it weren't for Quintus's intervention, there'd be one less pirate in the world." Suddenly, Brutus remembered something. He turned to the legate. "Quintus, we need to get back to the shore. Those feathered savages might seize the galley." "Jupiter. I forgot about it," Quintus cursed. Bess cleaned his blood-stained blade with sand, sheathed it, and followed his allies, pondering the strange turn of events that had made him friends with his recent enemies. The tribe in which he was born was one of many inhabiting the mountainous north of Thrace, a harsh land that had blunted the ambitions of many Roman generals. Before seeing 15 winters, he had charged at the walls of border forts, alongside his kin, wreaking bloody havoc on all Roman attempts to subdue them. In one such battle, bloodied and unconscious, he was taken into Roman slavery. But no slavery could teach the wild son of the Rocky Mountains submission and obedience. His first master, to whom he was sold, he killed with a single punch. The brother of the slain man sold the Thracian to an amphitheater, turning his life into a game for the plebeians' amusement. But Bess never lost a fight. One night, he killed the gladiatorial school's owner, escaped, and freed about 30 fellow cutthroats. Together they settled in nearby highlands, terrifying the Romans with bloodthirsty raids and accepting other enemies of the empire under his command. A bounty of entire talents of gold was placed on his head, and punitive squads roamed the mountains and plains of Rome to their doom. Bess decimated them with a ferocity unique to him, showing his contempt for the Roman legions, for which he paid dearly. Legate Quintus, Caesar's cousin, swore to capture him. The emperor's personal guard, led by the Roman noblemen, tracked down the Thracian and his gang. Late at night, when Bess and his men camped by the hills of Illyria, Quintus attacked. Initially in the panic, the gladiators fell like flies. But soon, Bess managed to reorganize his fighters and put up a worthy defense against the legionnaires. A titanic battle ensued on the Illyrian hills, with heavy losses on both sides. Bess tore through the legionnaire ranks, using all the skills he'd acquired in arena battles. But what could a handful of brave men do against 200 of Caesar's personal guard? The Romans had the advantage of numbers, and although the gladiators fought like demons for their lives, the legionnaires slowly and inevitably prevailed. However, victory came at a great cost, as they paid dearly for every inch of ground. Bess's pursuit was long and relentless, and the Praetorians poured all their accumulated rage from months of the campaign into them. The slaughter was long, fierce, and bloody. Under the enemy's pressure, the gladiators began to retreat, losing men. Blood flowed like a river, and by the shore only a handful of fighters remained with Bess, many of whom were wounded and barely standing from exhaustion. Somewhere on the northern shore of the Aegean Sea, the gladiators got lucky. They found a large fishing boat in the reeds. They immediately set sail. But a Roman war galley commanded by Quintus caught up with them to the south. For the first time, Bess faced someone as stubborn and determined as himself. The Thracian realized that if he didn't kill Quintus, the Roman would pursue him forever. As soon as the fragile fishing boat touched the side of the Roman galley, Bess leaped forward, A handful of fighters followed him, and a bloody battle unfolded on Quintus's ship. The narrow passages along the hold played to their advantage. The Praetorians could attack only 2 at a time. The skirmish was brief but bloody. The clanging of swords and the groans of the dying still echoed in Bess's mind. Soon, he was the last one standing amidst the enemy. But Zalmoxis, the formidable deity of the Thracians, gave him another chance for salvation. Beyond the galley's side, he unexpectedly saw the gentle slope of an island's shoreline not far away. The Thracian slashed down, splitting the skull of a particularly eager legionnaire, turned, and with his hands above his head and the sword on his back, dove into the water and swam. Thus, he ended up on this island. The forest abruptly ended, and they emerged onto a large sandy beach. But the galley had vanished as if it had sunk into the water. Vitus turned to Quintus. His face showed confusion. "By Dis, it was here," he exclaimed. "Those feathered devils couldn't have carried off a galley laden with weapons. Unloading it would have taken many hours. Besides, there were 40 chained rowers on board, and I have the keys to their shackles." "Could it simply have sailed away?" asked the Thracian. "Maybe those in feathers forced the rowers to row." This argument was irrefutable. Vitus fell silent, glaring. Bess carefully inspected the shoreline sand. However, he found no footprints. The Thracian looked at Quintus. "I'm curious about the ship," Quintus said. "You said you fought here. So why are there no footprints except for your own? Maybe the natives took the bodies and smoothed the sand." Vitus shrugged. "It seems to me something is wrong on this island." Brutus's voice suddenly broke the silence. "What do you mean?" Quintus asked him. "Southern coastal tribes have a legend. Long ago, when these lands were young, they were inhabited by a pre-human race. The ancient empire was vast, its borders extending far north and disappearing into the impenetrable southern jungles. This race worshipped ancient gods, and bloody sacrifices nightly stained the altars of terrifying monsters. Then, the human gods cursed this land. One starless night, the empire's land sank beneath the water. Thus ended the empire of fear, blood, and ancient gods. However, remnants of that ancient race still survive, living on Mediterranean islands that were once mountain peaks. "Amusing tales you tell, Brutus," Quintus remarked after some silence. "But I have neither the time nor the desire to listen to them. I swore to find Mark's killer, and he is hiding somewhere on this island. To hell with gods, demons, and ancient races. Right now, I want to know where these natives live. By Jupiter, we find them. We find Mark's killer." Brutus shook his head but said nothing. Suddenly, Tiberius, one of the 2 rescued legionnaires with a face as white as snow, stepped toward Quintus. "Demons or gods, we need to get out of here as soon as possible. I don't want to be another victim of whoever killed Mark." "Did Brutus's stories scare you?" Quintus sneered. "Good soldier for my royal relative's guard. You should wear a skirt, cowardly dog." The legionnaire recoiled for a moment, but then, gripping the hilt of his sword, spoke again. "I followed you without asking for anything. I endured all the hardships in the wild lands of Thrace, Illyricum, and said nothing. Now I'll speak. You're driven mad by your thirst for revenge, and—" He didn't have time to finish as Quintus, his face twisted in rage, drew his sword. "Filthy dog, stinking slave." The nobleman swung his blade. Tiberius tried to avoid the blow, but it was too late. In his fury, Quintus split the legionnaire's helmet along with his skull. Bleeding profusely, he fell to the ground. "Do you have something to say, Valerius?" Quintus pointed the bloodied blade at the other Praetorian who had started to move toward him. He shook his head and turned away. "If not, then we set out to find these creatures' settlement." Quintus sheathed his sword. I think we should split up. Vitus and I will go west. Brutus and Valerius, south. And you, Bess, will go east. We'll meet back here when the sun is above the hill." With that, he turned his back to them, and with Vitus, headed west. Brutus shook his head, nodded at Bess, and tapping Valerius on the shoulder, walked with him toward the forest. The Thracian hesitated. He had known the Briton for a long time, and his stories did not seem like childish bedtime tales. Brutus had seen too much to scare seasoned warriors with foolish legends. However, after some thought, he decided not to burden his mind and walked along the shore to the east. Chapter 2. Swords, Fangs, and Spears. The shoreline gradually rose upward, turning into a mountain path that wound around the slope of a cliff, descending steeply. The Thracian moved forward with a quick yet cautious stride, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The silence around him seemed deceptive and unsettling. Below, beneath the cliff, the sea roared like an enraged beast. Bess frowned. Everything was going too smoothly and calmly. The Thracian walked swiftly, but still managed to survey the surroundings. To his right, there were thick, impassable thickets of grass, as tall as a man. The barbarian felt that an attack would likely come from there. Suddenly, Bess sensed danger. Ahead, the path turned around the slope. Cautiously, he inspected the corner, but saw nothing. However, he suddenly caught the scent of fur, and almost immediately, a lithe feline body leaped at him from the thickets. The Thracian jumped back along the path, dodging the razor-sharp claws of the predator. There was an angry growl as the beast realized its prey had slipped away. They stood facing each other, man and beast, both preparing to attack and defend. Bess had never seen such a creature in his life. The beast resembled a tiger or lynx from his homeland, but was twice as massive and undoubtedly much stronger. Despite its apparent bulk, the barbarian could feel it. The creature could move faster than a panther and was certainly more dangerous. From its saliva-dripping jaws protruded long, dagger-like fangs. The barbarian understood that before he could draw his sword, the beast would tear him to shreds. He could only rely on his agility and wits. The Thracian crouched and cautiously extended his hands forward. The saber-toothed beast, noticing the movement, growled and prepared to pounce. Bess waited, anticipating the beast's terrifying speed and knowing he couldn't count on victory. The creature sprang up, trying to catch the man off guard. Partially succeeding, its sharp claws grazed the unprotected chest of the Thracian, leaving bloody gashes. The force of the impact knocked Bess off balance, and grabbing the animal by the throat, he fell onto the rocky path. The beast snarled, tearing at the barbarian's body with its claws. Opening its terrible mouth, filled with sharp fangs, the saber-toothed tiger snarled furiously, trying to reach Bess's neck. The Thracian tightened his muscular grip on the creature's throat, understanding he had only one chance. The monstrous jaws inched closer, the beast's strength truly terrifying. Struggling to free himself, Bess pinned the creature beneath him. His muscles bulged like steel cables under his skin from the inhuman exertion. Grasping the beast's scruff, the Thracian growled and sank his teeth into the creature's throat, seemingly ignoring the tiger's claws savaging his body. He tasted blood on his lips. Suddenly, something snapped under Bess's hands, and the beast's claws scrabbled at the ground in agony. Exhausted, Bess flung the dying body aside and staggered to his feet. Blood oozed from the numerous wounds left by the beast's claws and fangs. His head spun, but the barbarian had endured an ordeal that would have cost others their lives. Still trembling from the tension, Bess noticed a figure dart past the corner. Growling with rage, he gave chase. Rounding the cliff, he saw a native girl, desperately fleeing up the path. With 2 strides, Bess caught up to her and struck her down with a punch. His eyes gleaming with fury, the barbarian drew his sword, raised it over the figure sprawled on the ground, and suddenly recoiled. The native turned out to be a girl, with long black hair like the Thracians and brown eyes that looked at him fearfully. She was about to scream. Bess quickly covered her mouth with his hand and pressed a finger to his lips, urging silence. She nodded, her frightened gaze never leaving him, and the Thracian cautiously removed his hand. "Who are you?" The girl shook her head and babbled something in a strange, melodic language, gesticulating animatedly. "Damn it," the barbarian grumbled in annoyance. "I doubt I understood a single word of that gibberish. Can you speak in a way I can understand? What's your name?" "Venari," she unexpectedly replied. "So you do understand me?" The Thracian smirked. "My name is Bess." "We had slaves who spoke this language." Venari was still frightened. "I learned it to understand what they were saying. The barbarians often talked about their country, and I liked listening to their stories. Zenu said it was forbidden to listen to them. He said the world around us had died, buried under a layer of water. Only the barbarians still lived on the lands north of Balgor. Your Zenu lied to you." The Thracian shook his head. "The world isn't dead. In all directions from this island, there are vast lands populated by people. Are you going to kill me now?" Tears welled up in the girl's eyes. The barbarian shook his head. "Why would I do that? You're one of the killers who arrived in Balgor this morning." Venari shrugged her delicate shoulders. "And they kill my people. That's what Zenu says." "Who the hell is this damn Zenu?" Bess cursed. "He's the high priest of Bagal." The girl touched her forehead with her hands. "The one who always returns." "Well?" Bess didn't get to finish. Voices speaking Venari's language could be heard ahead. The girl became agitated. "They must be looking for me. Zenu sent the warriors. If they see us together, we'll both die." The voices were getting closer. Bess pressed a finger to his lips and ducked into the thickets, hoping the girl wouldn't give him away. The procession that appeared from around the corner consisted of 12 natives, led by an elderly man with hair as white as snow, dressed in a pristine robe, holding a staff. Venari rose to meet them. The old man stopped beside the girl and asked her something. She gestured vaguely and shrugged. Shaking his head, the elder motioned for her to follow him. As soon as the natives disappeared around the bend, Bess emerged from the thickets and followed. Far ahead, he could see the backs of the natives. They quickly ascended the path into the mountains. Trying not to fall behind, the Thracian quickened his pace. He didn't have to walk for long. About 20 stadia from where he had killed the saber-toothed tiger, the path ended in a rocky wall. The natives stopped, and the old man, pushing aside the branches of an olive tree, stepped into a dark opening. Bess waited until the last native disappeared into the passage and followed them. Darkness enveloped him momentarily, but the barbarian was undeterred. Far from here, in the mountains of Thrace, he had wandered through dark caves as a child, so the darkness didn't frighten him. Without hesitation, he made his way through the corridor, trying not to lose sight of the last dark silhouette. It seemed the natives could see in the dark as well as Bess. At least they didn't light any fires and moved quickly through the corridor. After some time of continuous wandering, Bess noticed a steadily increasing spot of bright light ahead. With each step, it came closer, and soon it became clear that it was an arched passage into a large cave. As the natives began to disappear one by one into the opening, the barbarian saw one of them, holding a spear, standing guard at the entrance. Cursing, Bess turned into a side passage and hid. Killing the guard was pointless. Before the Thracian could reach him, he would alert the entire underground. There was only one option: to wait for a favorable moment to sneak into the cave. But first, he needed to warn Quintus and the legionaries. Quintus cast another glance to the east and, shaking his head, turned to Brutus. "Damn that Thracian. He's taking too long. Don't you think he's just run off?" "No." The Briton shook his head. "He'll come. Bess keeps his word. He's probably found the trail." "I hope you're right, Brutus. Otherwise—" "He's right." Quintus suddenly heard the Thracian's voice. The Roman flinched. "I've found the trail." Bess was descending the hill along the path. "Where have you been?" Quintus's voice broke. The Thracian remained silent, but noted the madness in the Roman's eyes. It seemed that in his thirst for revenge, the legate had completely lost his mind. "Up in the mountains I found a girl from these natives." Bess addressed Brutus more than the Roman. "Following her, I found their settlement. The mountains around are like a honeycomb, and deep inside there's a city. I didn't see it myself, but I think I'm right. The entrance to the main cave is guarded. I saw one guard, but no one can guarantee he's the only one." "Enough talking," Quintus barked. "Where are they?" Bess clenched his fists, but restrained himself. "I'll show you." The path once again led him to the mountain trail when suddenly ahead the Thracian saw an army of painted natives. Dancing and hooting, they moved in their direction. Cursing on the go, Bess drew his sword and took a defensive stance. Behind him, he heard the sound of steel. Roman soldiers were preparing for battle. The Thracian glanced around. The narrow strip of the trail didn't allow for full deployment. Nevertheless, the barbarian gripped the sword's hilt tighter, ready to sell his life dearly. The natives paused for a moment, then surged forward like a wave. Everything mixed into a single melee. It was a song of death, and no one hoped or wanted to escape. Bess struck with his sword and felt someone's innards against his hand. Then someone fell at his feet, and the crowd trampled the fallen. Spinning like a top in the wild vortex of death, the Thracian struck, turning flesh into chunks of meat. Like a whirlwind, he darted with a sword in hand, astonishing the natives with his inhuman agility and strength. But despite these qualities, he didn't remain unscathed. Numerous bloody wounds were left by the natives' spears. Mixing with sweat, blood flowed down his body, forming intricate patterns, but the madness of battle had already consumed him. Laughing like a devil, he brought the heavy blade down on another enemy's head. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Brutus and the Romans fighting, but then Valerius fell, and a swarm of colorful bodies covered him. Quintus, with a mad gleam in his eyes, wielded his short sword, slashing the natives' bellies. But despite their valor, both Bess and Brutus understood they couldn't hold out for long. The natives outnumbered them 10-1, pressing their mass against the 4 brave men. The numerical advantage was taking its toll, and soon, forced to retreat, the Romans and Bess were pinned against the cliff. Feeling the cold stone against his back, Bess knew that soon they would be crushed, swept away in an instant. Deflecting spears with his blade, the Thracian, like a cornered beast, glanced around, secretly hoping for a miracle. And it happened. During one of the natives' thrusts, Bess leaned back and, swinging, hit something with his elbow. The rock behind him unexpectedly gave way, and losing his balance, Bess fell into an opening. At the last moment, he managed to soften his fall, and rolling across the stone floor, he jumped to his feet. The rock closed behind him, sealing him off from the fight. Bess lunged forward but only struck the stone. His search for the lever that opened the passage was futile. He only managed to find a small window through which he could see the Romans fiercely fending off the advancing natives. The Thracian had no choice but to watch, grinding his teeth in frustration. Beyond the wall, the battle was not going in the Romans' favor. The horde of natives relentlessly advanced, and new fighters replaced the fallen. However, it was evident that they didn't intend to kill, but wanted to capture the Romans. Their spears inflicted non-lethal wounds, only scratching the defenders. The Romans grew increasingly tired, their sword strokes becoming less frequent. Their bodies were covered in wounds, and with the blood, their strength was draining away. They were barely standing from exhaustion. Suddenly, a native spear pierced Vitus's leg. Crying out in pain, he fell to his knees, clutching the bleeding wound. In that instant, the natives swarmed over him like a wave. Vitus's injury spelled defeat. A breach opened in the Romans' defense, which the natives quickly exploited. In a moment, it was over. The Romans were knocked down and tied up in the blink of an eye. The Thracian cursed behind the wall. He didn't know why they had been captured, but he was furious he couldn't help them. Looking through the window, he saw the Romans being forced to their feet, prodded with spear shafts, and surrounded on all sides, led up the path. Watching the procession, Bess turned away. Now, he was only concerned with one thing: how to help the Romans. Ahead of him was a black opening, the only exit from the round chamber he found himself in by chance. Carefully, the Thracian slipped into it and found himself in a long corridor extending both ways. Bess hesitated, weighing his options. Both ends of the corridor disappeared into darkness, and only the gods knew where they led. Cursing, he chose the left corridor and moved along the wall, feeling his way forward. Time lost all meaning in this dark underground carved into the rock's depths. Many times, Bess noticed dark openings appearing to his right and left, but guided by primal instincts, he stuck to the main tunnel. Time passed, and Bess no longer knew if it was day or night. His eyes soon adapted to the darkness, and he began to see faded drawings and symbols on the corridor walls, evidently carved by an ancient people in times immemorial. Bess was no scholar. He was a warrior, and the drawings covering the tunnel walls filled him with superstitious dread. Horrifying winged demons with beastly faces were carved into the stone with incomprehensible realism. In ghastly grins, they loomed over their victims or tore them apart with clawed hands. The Thracian felt the darkness around him grow even thicker, reaching out to him with sticky fingers. The tunnel ran straight, and Bess had started to think it was endless when he suddenly saw a bright light ahead, painful for the eyes. The Thracian slowed his pace and held his breath. Ahead, the tunnel turned sharply to the right, and light poured from around the corner, casting strange reflections on the walls. Carefully pressing against the wall, he peeked around the corner. The bright light of torches placed on either side of a heavy copper-clad door illuminated a lone figure standing at the threshold like a statue. Clad in feathers, the solitary guard leaned wearily on his spear, his eyes half closed in a drowsy stupor. Evidently, his carelessness was due to the infrequent use of this passage. Oblivious to his surroundings, the native stared at the doors he was guarding, swatting at pesky insects, his movements casting peculiar shadows in the torchlight. Therefore, when he felt the muscular body behind him, he was more surprised than frightened. He was still marveling when the Thracian's blade descended with terrifying force, slicing him from shoulder to mid-chest. The barbarian would have preferred to face the guard head-on, but he had no intention of letting him alarm the entire underground. Gently lowering the twitching, dying body, Bess slid towards the door and pushed it with all his might. Slowly and heavily, it swung open, allowing the mountaineer to slip through the gap. Chapter 3. The Sanctuary. In the darkness, sliced by a narrow strip of light from the corridor, Bess crept forward with the caution of a tiger, gripping his sword. The light barely sufficed to reveal even darker spots on the walls, covered in some kind of drawings. Ahead, the Thracian noticed the dim gleam of a smoky lamp embedded in the floor before the feet of a colossal statue, seemingly carved from a solid piece of black marble. Behind the statue, Bess saw the dark shapes of outspread wings. A chill ran down the Thracian's spine. His primal instincts sensed a threat emanating from the motionless stone. What sculptor had so vividly conveyed the image of a creature poised for flight? Could art be so realistic? Or a primordial fear gripped Bess's soul, the same fear that had driven his distant ancestors across the northern cliffs, fleeing from the terrible predators of the ancient world. Covered in cold sweat, the mountaineer stared at the gigantic figure on the pedestal, frozen in mid-flight. Cautiously, as if spellbound, the barbarian touched the statue with his palm. He immediately recoiled in fear. Contrary to his expectation, the stone was not cold. It seemed to radiate a very human warmth. Curiosity once again overcame fear, and Bess placed his hands into the open palms of the statue. Instantly, it felt as if a bright flash exploded before his eyes. Images and scenes, shrouded in the aura of antiquity and covered in the dust of ages, flickered in his mind. These fragments overshadowed the present, becoming clearer and more distinct. The Thracian felt as though he was soaring over vast, endless lands. Huge, untouched tracts of land and pastures stretched from north to south and from west to east, to the very horizon. In the north, near an immense green sea of forests, stood a vast white stone city, astonishing in its splendor and beauty, with its sky-reaching towers and mighty ziggurats. In the city's center, on a high hill encircled by a chain of crenellated walls with arrow slits, rose a castle of strange design. Bess had never seen such magnificence. The Roman palaces of patricians would pale in comparison to this castle. Elegant colonnades and staircases, seeming to ascend to the very abode of the gods, encircled the building on all sides. The palace walls, inlaid with transparent stones and platinum, could not be matched even by the chambers of the richest Roman, Caesar himself. Bess's gaze, and it seemed to him he himself, descended to the city's cool alleys lined with fountains in lush gardens. Suddenly, everything changed sharply, and the barbarian felt the scene slipping away, giving way to a completely different one. High in the incomprehensible sky, winged giants on black wings soared like demons. They swept through the sunlit sky like a typhoon, and like thunder in a clear day, burst into the white stone city. Their powerful bodies, seemingly carved from a single piece of black marble, flashed among the houses and alleys, apparently searching for the city's defenders. And the defenders soon appeared. Similar giants, but with snow-white wings, flew out of the huge palace and attacked the invaders. Bess became the sole witness to the fierce battle that erupted in the skies. The white-winged beings died like flies under the heavy blades of the black giants. The invaders were much more numerous and far stronger. Bess ground his teeth in impotent rage. The scene changed again, and the barbarian saw large crowds of slaves dying on dark altars, drenched in something red, with a black figure standing beside them, wings folded behind. Image after image shifted, and before the Thracian appeared a roaring sea, its waters engulfing vast lands. It seemed as if the sky and earth had swapped places. Lightning struck the darkened heavens, expressing the gods' wrath. Suddenly, Bess felt his palms burning with unbearable fire. He opened his mouth, but only a half-strangled gasp escaped his parched throat. In desperation, Bess jerked in a final effort, and suddenly freed himself. He lay on the altar at the statue's feet, trying to calm the trembling that had seized his body. Glancing at the dark silhouette of the statue, looming over him like a monstrous condor, Bess instinctively rolled aside, shuddering in horror. His hands trembled as he picked up his sword from the floor, somehow flung nearly an arm's length from where he had stood. The creak of ungreased hinges made him dive behind the pedestal. Internally trembling, the Thracian pressed himself against the marble and hid. A slender female figure, wrapped in a gray robe, crossed the hall and stopped opposite the Thracian's hiding place. Raising her hands in a prayerful gesture, the girl began to speak in the native tongue, apparently asking something of her god. Of all the words she said, Bess recognized only Xenu. Finally, she fell silent, pulled back her hood, and the barbarian recognized her as Venari. Slowly, the native girl moved around the hall, lighting torches and accompanying each action with strange words in her language. With each word, the hall grew brighter and brighter, and the barbarian realized she would soon see him. He moved like a shadow toward the girl, and before she could scream, clamped a hand over her mouth. "Quiet, Venari, it's me." Bess turned her to face him. "Why did you come?" she asked fearfully. "Outsiders aren't allowed here. This is the sanctuary of Balgor. Xenu will kill you if he sees you." "We'll see," Bess smirked. "Tell me instead, do you know where the Romans captured today are?" Venari shivered in his arms as if from the cold. "They're in the northern cave. They're being prepared for sacrifice." "What sacrifice?" the barbarian asked in surprise. "To whom?" "Before dawn they will be killed on Bagal's altar in the main sanctuary." The girl glanced at the Thracian with caution. She still feared his anger. "Do you know where this altar is?" Bess grabbed her shoulders. "I need to get there." Venari shook her head. "You can't go there. It's death. The god will punish you, and me along with you." "Show me the way, Venari." The Thracian was losing patience. "And I swear by Zalmoxis's beard, girl, you can go wherever you want." "You'll die." The native girl nearly wept, clutching his arms. Bess growled in fury and shook her like a doll. "Damn you, Venari." "All right." The girl suddenly calmed down. "I'll show you. You seek death, Bess, but I can't stop you if you don't want to be stopped." Together with the girl, the Thracian walked to the central door of the sanctuary, which led into a wide, brightly lit corridor. Slowly, Bess followed Venari, keeping his hand on the sword's hilt and glancing around. The girl moved confidently through the familiar passages, and soon the barbarian realized that without her help, he wouldn't be able to find his way back. But he didn't want to return. All his thoughts were occupied with the Romans and Brutus. Knowing they would soon become sacrificial lambs brought him no satisfaction. It wasn't that he cared for them. They were simply people in whom he saw kindred spirits. He knew well what they were and what to expect from them. But these islanders with their unknown gods were foreign and incomprehensible to him. Finally, the corridors and turns led Venari and her mighty companion to a huge door clad in copper and iron, covered with incomprehensible hieroglyphs and tiles. The girl stopped, and turning to Bess, nodded at the door. "This door leads to Bagal's temple. You'll find what you seek there. This door is rarely used, so you won't encounter anyone on your way to the sanctuary. I can't go further with you. Bagal is cruel to women. He doesn't allow them into the temple, so you'll go on alone." Bess took her hand. "Thank you, Venari. Zalmoxis bears witness. I couldn't have found the way without you." Don't thank me for what you'll later curse." Venari smiled bitterly. "When you die, Venari will weep for you." With these words, she turned and quickly walked away as if afraid to look back. The Thracian watched her go. A storm of thoughts raged within him, but he pushed them aside, focusing entirely on the desire to free the Romans. He leaned against the massive door with his shoulder, and with the caution of a hunting panther, entered the dimly lit hall. When the door quietly closed behind him, Bess slid like a gray shadow among the ancient bas-reliefs and high columns covered in tiles. The primitive instinct of the barbarian sharpened within the Thracian. He felt the ancient sorcery permeating this place, sensed with his skin the strange magic that had arisen at the dawn of time. Unusual statues, crowned with grinning skulls and seemingly mocking him, flashed by. Bess shuddered. With an effort of will, he tore his mind away from the terrifying thoughts predicting his death and delved deeper into the hall. In his memory, the images conjured by the strange statue in the hall with the altar had not yet faded. With his primal mind, he struggled to understand these visions, but in vain. Bess shook his head, dispelling the illusions. The spacious hall led him to a low door, suited for a child or a dwarf. At a single touch it opened, allowing the Thracian to step into the darkened corridor beyond. Without hesitation he stepped inside, passing under its arches. Chapter 4. The One Who Always Returns. Inhaling the stale air of the dungeon, the Thracian pushed through the veil of cobwebs in the pitch-black primordial darkness. Venari had not lied. This passage had not been used since the founding of Rome, and now it was inhabited only by rats, spiders, and other resilient denizens of the dark. He felt something smooth slither over his leg. He jumped back sharply and thrust his sword into the spot where his foot had just been, hearing a hiss and rustle. The disturbed snake coiled and retreated to the wall, warning the careless intruder not to tempt fate by confronting it on the narrow path. Swallowing nervously, the barbarian pressed against the opposite wall and slowly moved forward, listening intently to the menacing hiss until it faded behind him. Then he continued as before, with his sword in hand, carefully placing his half-bent legs, ready for the sudden danger that seemed to permeate the surrounding space. The corridor seemed endless, but soon the barbarian felt a cold draft on his face and then heard the sound of dripping water. His instincts told him that a larger chamber lay ahead. Perhaps the very hall of Bagal that the native girl had mentioned. Moving like a hunting lion, Bess quickly walked forward, stopping only at the semicircular opening from which a faint light emanated. Peering cautiously inside, the Thracian saw a huge obelisk serving as a pedestal for a winged statue similar to the one he had seen in this underground city, but much more imposing. The statue stood on a natural elevation, beneath which was a large rectangular monolith covered in inscriptions and images of bones and skulls, symbols of death among all the tribes known to Bess. There was no doubt. It was an altar, long soaked in human blood. Visions that had visited Bess at the first statue flashed through his mind. He recognized this place from the scenes of the past, an eerie temple where rituals against human nature had been performed for centuries. The barbarian shuddered with disgust, but overcoming the unpleasant feeling, continued to survey from his hiding place. A wide staircase, carved directly into the rock by unknown ancient builders, led to the altar. At its base was a small round basin, its water reflecting the torchlight, casting ominous glints on the sanctuary's vaults. A whole procession of native warriors in skirts of colorful feathers had formed by the basin. Nearby were priests in dark hooded robes. The Thracian also saw the glint of legionary armor. All four were alive and now stood, surrounded by savages, unarmed and bound. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes staring blankly, and their mouths hung open like those of the insane. Bess understood. The Romans had been drugged with some witchcraft potion, stripping them of their will. The task became more complicated. Now that the emperor's valiant Praetorians had turned into mindless sacrificial animals, they could neither comprehend what was happening nor fight at the right moment, and all the responsibility for their rescue fell solely on the barbarian's shoulders. Bess grimly smiled at the thought. It seemed it was his fate to risk his own skin to save his sworn enemies. Meanwhile, the native warriors had formed a semicircle around the basin, leaving space for the priests and the captured legionaries. Clad in their long cloaks, the servants of unknown gods approached the prisoners and led one of them by the arms. Bess recognized Vitus, whose wounded leg had been carefully bandaged by someone. An elderly man in a white cloak resembling a Roman senator's toga separated from the priests and solemnly ascended the steps to the monolith at the feet of the fearsome winged idol. The priest was familiar to the Thracian. Zenu, as Venari had called him, gave a signal to his subordinates, and they led the docile, uncomprehending legionary to the foot of the giant statue, untied his hands, and laid him on the altar before the elder. Leaning on his staff, the gray-haired priest extended his right hand over him and began to chant words that bore no resemblance to the melodic bird-like language in which the savages communicated among themselves. Moreover, these words did not resemble any other known language to the Thracian, and, in this, the barbarian would swear in unison with the elder. A rising, enveloping horror, an inhuman voice echoed. The incantation resonated under the underground vaults with a threatening, predatory growl, as if carried by a distant echo from the unfathomable depths of time, or from the very bowels of Hades. The gray-haired priest raised his staff, and Bess saw the silver glint of the tip. The seemingly harmless stick turned out to be a ritual spear, poised to pierce the Roman's heart. Without hesitation, the Thracian left his hiding place behind the winged idol, ran to Zenu, and before the priest could lower his spear or turn, Bess turned him around and impaled him on his sword like a fish on a spit. With wide-open eyes, the gray-haired priest gasped a few words in an ancient, forgotten language at Bess, then went limp, dropping the spear from his hands, and hung lifelessly on the Thracian's sword. Without waiting for anyone to react, Bess pulled the sword from the body, kicked Vitus off the altar so that he tumbled down the steps. A grave-like silence hung in the hall. Only the blood of the slain priest dripped thickly from the blade onto the ancient monolith. "Well, now's the time to sell my skin dearly," the Thracian said to no one in particular, raising his sword. Fierce battles with iron legions and fights in the amphitheater arenas had taught him to face the enemy without trembling. But the savages, on the contrary, hesitated to attack. They still remembered too well this huge foreign warrior, who, like a living lightning, had taken the lives of many of their comrades, and they had not yet recovered from the shock of Zenu's sudden death at the hands of the same warrior. But the hesitation lasted only a moment. The natives soon regrouped, screamed wildly, and bristling with spears, ran up the steps. "We'll stick together, Thracian," Bess suddenly heard Latin words, "and try to break through to our men." It was Vitus, who had come to his senses, grabbed the priest's spear, and stood next to the barbarian, ready to repel the attack of the native warriors. Bess only nodded in response. There was no time for more, and met the first native to reach them with an unstoppable sword strike, as inevitable as death itself. The man fell at the feet of his comrades with his face split in two, and the Thracian sword continued its own life, cutting spear tips aimed at the barbarian, slicing, piercing, and chopping enemy bodies. It joyfully rang every time it managed to drink human blood, as if the blood made it sharper, stronger, and more dangerous in battle. Behind Bess, the ritual spear held firmly by Praetorian Vitus repeatedly struck out, wounding the natives before retreating behind the massive figure of the barbarian. Both the freedom-loving Thracian and the legionary, utterly loyal to his emperor, now acted as one, fighting with the fury of the doomed, together descending the stone staircase step by step, repelling the attacks of the frenzied savages and relentlessly pushing them toward the basin. In the chaos of the battle, neither the natives nor the visitors from the outside world noticed the blood boiling on Bagal's sacrificial stone, the dark water in the basin swirling and bubbling, and the immense black shadows thickening under the vaults of the hall. Bess, just in time, Thracian. Brutus's voice suddenly rang out. I thought these devils had managed to deal with you too, and we would have to part with life today. I'm so glad I was wrong. As if to prove his joy, the Briton spread his mighty arms, and the thick vines binding them snapped like flimsy threads. It was evident that the native of misty Albion could have done this at any moment, but only with the Thracian's appearance did he begin to save his own skin. Priests nearby rushed at him, but Brutus scattered them like autumn leaves in the wind, adding bruises and broken bones in the process. Then he roughly shook Valerius and Quintus to rouse them from their stupor, and joined the fight against the dark-skinned warriors, attacking from the rear. Meanwhile, steam billowed over the basin. The black water boiled fiercely, spilling over the edge. The walls and vaults of the underground temple trembled, and shadows flitted around the hall. Everyone in the underground chamber froze, the outsiders in confusion, wondering what was happening, the natives in some sort of fanatical excitement. Bess, obeying instinct, turned and raised his head and gasped, "Zalmox." The statue of the monstrous creature on the pedestal came to life, and it was no trick of light and shadow. Spreading its wings, it flew down to the altar, bending over Zenu's bloodied corpse. Bagal, oh Bagal, echoed among the natives. Reverent awe and joyous ecstasy were evident on their faces. Heads bowed in reverence, some howled mournfully, others raised their hands to the sky, and a wild ritual dance began. Naked, dark-skinned bodies twisted and contorted into the most incredible poses. The movements were both terrifying and beautiful. In the wide-open eyes of these people burned unconditional devotion and worship of the monster. The unparalleled magical dance was dedicated to the bloodthirsty god Balgor, who had now taken on flesh. Seeing that Zenu was dead, the monster let out an ear-splitting roar, echoed by the cavernous hall. Then it turned its heavy gaze on the people. Its wings spread and flapped, raising a wind. It soared to the vault and hovered above the crowd. A voice resounded in Bess's head, penetrating to his very soul. "Listen to me, mortal. I am Bagal, the one who always returns. Thousands of years ago, my people and I arrived here from a world that has now forever closed its eyes in timelessness. Here on our journey, we encountered adversaries equal in strength, but we claimed the greatest kingdom on earth from them and ruled not as kings, but as gods. The humans who inhabited the vast lands began to worship us in numerous temples and sacrificed their finest sons and daughters to appease us. Human blood gave us strength and prolonged our lives, becoming the elixir of our immortality. This continued until the planet itself rose against my kin and buried the empire they had built under a layer of water. But the last temple of Balgor remained, and I am the sole ruler of what is left of the once great dominion. My loyal slaves over the years transformed from a civilized race into a tribe of naked savages, but they still worship me. Here, on a small patch of land amid endless waters, they continue to drench my altar with human blood, and I command them. No one dared to disturb the peace of this island until people in iron armor arrived on a ship laden with weapons, with a large number of rowers at the oars. Then my children called upon me, and I punished the intruders. The men in iron were torn apart like others offered to me in sacrifice. The ship, along with all its contents, was transported by ancient magic to a lagoon on the southern coast of my land. But it turned out that the remaining people from the ship penetrated my domain, and with them was you. Yes, I see you, sacrilegious one. You dared to secretly enter my home, spill the blood of my loyal priest on the altar, and raise your hand against my slaves. You will pay for this, and the price will be great. I will make you beg for mercy, crush your will, infuse the deepest corners of your soul with pain and fear, mutilate your body, and leave you to die on my altar. The voice reverberated in the Thracian's temples, resonated within his skull, infecting his mind with pain and terror. But the warrior did not succumb to this madness, though the ordeal cost him tremendous effort. He turned his whole body toward the monster and replied, not with speech, but with thought, for he was certain the creature heard him just as he had heard it. "You'll have to try very hard, creature, to fulfill your threats," the warrior responded. "No beast or man has ever been happy to have fought Bess of Thrace. You are merely a chimera, a shadow, a ghost of long-forgotten eras. Only a pitiful, degenerate tribe with a slave mentality worships you, living in the small, confined world of this island. So come here and feel the strength of a free man on your skin." The blood god's face twisted into a grotesque grimace, bearing sharp fangs. Enraged by the mortal's audacity, it lunged at the Thracian. Bess raised his sword to meet the monster, and an unequal battle ensued. An otherworldly creature against a mortal warrior. Steel flashed, leathery wings flapped, cries and fierce howls resounded. It was a dance of death, from which only one could emerge alive. The winged colossus was incredibly strong, and Bess received many marks from its claws at the start of the attack. But when the Thracian struck it with the sword's tip, it recoiled with a howl. The barbarian saw dark blood oozing from a gash on the black wing and realized, having taken on flesh, this creature, whatever it truly was, had gained all the qualities inherent in a living body, including vulnerability and mortality. Gripping the hilt tighter, Bess climbed the steps to the altar, the highest point in the hall. From there, it was easier for him to reach the flying monster. Bagal now had much less space to maneuver. The battlefield was confined to the pedestal, the sacrificial stone, and the overhead vault of the underground chamber. Yet it attacked desperately, slashing at the man with claws and trying to reach his throat with dagger-like teeth from its predatory maw. Bess defended himself with his sword, not thinking of the pain and wounds, striking wherever he could, and although the colossus's skin was like iron armor, many blows left deep cuts on the black body. Suddenly, in the heat of battle, the Thracian met the monster's eyes, and then something incomprehensible to the human mind happened. Time seemed to freeze for the warrior, interrupting its swift passage. The sword lowered to his thigh, his arms hung limp, and his body refused to obey, standing motionless. Not understanding what was happening, the warrior vaguely felt a foreign will infiltrate his mind, suppressing any attempts to act. He could no longer look away from the opponent's hypnotic pupils. Forgetting everything, losing the ability to think and feel, as if chained by his gaze, he disappeared, drowning, dissolving in their blackness. Bess. The warrior heard his name through the foggy oblivion. "Do not look into his eyes. You must resist him. He is not your god, and he has no power over you. Look away." Before Bess's eyes, a ghostly face of a girl floated as if made of mist. A beautiful face. The girl called his name, though he did not recognize her. But something stirred in his soul, and he began to recognize Venari. The warrior blinked the sweat from his eyes. This simplest action threw him from non-existence into reality, and he saw the terrifying visage of Bagal right in front of him. The sharp fangs of the winged god were already at his throat, ready to sink into his flesh and drain all the blood from his veins. But it did not happen. The warrior's body seemed to move on its own, ahead of his thoughts. His right leg stepped back, taking on the weight of his body. His head and shoulders jerked to the side, saving his neck from the fatal attack. Then his right hand with the sword shot up, and the blade, like an extension of his arm, obediently entered under the monster's lower jaw, its tip emerging from the back of the head almost an arm's length. The monster let out an incoherent gurgle and wheeze. It had no voice left to scream. Bess pulled the blade from the skull and struck the neck with a powerful swing. The horrific head rolled down, bouncing on the steps. The body, in its final agony, spread its wings and flew toward the ceiling. After flying several yards above the stunned natives, drenching everything around with thick blood, it fell heavily into the basin. The boiling water gratefully accepted the honored sacrifice, and the creature's remains quickly sank into its impenetrable darkness. Chapter 5. The Fall of Balgor. Leaning on his sword, Bess surveyed the silent crowd and sneered disdainfully. "Your Bagal has gone to Tartarus along with his magic. Who among you wishes to follow him?" Silence was his answer. None of the savages moved. Their faces showed mixed emotions, but the battle fury had completely vanished from their eyes. Finally, one of the warriors, older and sturdier than the rest, chirped something to his comrades, and they all stepped back, dropping their spears to the floor and bowing in respectful submission. They acknowledged Bess's victory. "That's more like it, warriors," the Thracian laughed, wincing as pain shot through his body. "Hey, Quintus, Mark's killer is found and defeated. Isn't it time to get out of here?" The Roman legate did not answer, staring in bewilderment at the black water with wide eyes, a spark of obsession burning in them. Some mad idea had taken hold of him. Amazing, incredible, unbelievable. He muttered, stepping closer to the basin. What unknown abyss birthed this creature from its depths? By Jupiter, the world has not seen a monster with such powers. We were in the grip of an ancient horror that ruled over whole peoples, manipulating their minds like toys and building an empire on that power. And paid for such vileness with its head, Bess interrupted. "Listen, Quintus, don't waste time on incomprehensible musings. Order your men to follow me. We still need to find our way out." A powerful tremor shook the floor, walls, and vault of the underground hall, cutting Bess off. Another tremor quickly followed. The Thracian, raised in the mountains, knew this could mean the start of an earthquake or the awakening of a volcano. "Run if you don't want to be buried under these stones," the barbarian shouted, pointing to the narrow passage he had recently entered. "Follow me." Sheathing his sword, Bess leapt to the opening, dived through, and disappeared into the dark corridor. Hearing the clang and scrape of metal on stone, he nodded in satisfaction. The Romans were following him. "This way," he called, so his companions could follow his voice, as the tunnel was pitch dark. The sound of hobnailed boots convinced him that the legionaries were on the right path. Deep within the mountain, a heavy rumble and roar grew, the tremors intensifying, and Bess felt the stone floor trembling underfoot. The entire underground city must be shaking. Suddenly, the Thracian collided with something soft and alive. "Stop, Bess, it's me, Venari," a girl's voice chimed like a bell. "Follow me? I know a shortcut to the surface." A slender hand slipped into the barbarians and pulled him forward. Soon they stopped. The girl was searching for something in the dark. A moment later, Bess understood. Venari found an invisible lever, which moved an entire section of the wall. Light filtered through the opening, and the girl, Bess, and the trailing Romans stepped through. The passage led them to a wide, spiral staircase. 2 torches burned on the wall, and the Thracian took one for himself, handing the other to Brutus to pass back to the rear guard. The climb was long, accompanied by continuous underground tremors. Rock falls were already rumbling below. Stone dust trickled from above. Breathing heavily, Bess quickened his pace, now pulling Venari along with the sound of Romans panting and footsteps behind him. Finally, after ascending another turn of the staircase, the fugitives reached a platform before a sheer rock face. Venari confidently approached the rock, effortlessly turned a specific stone, and a huge door slid aside. Golden sunlight streamed through the opening. The Romans laughed like children, overjoyed at their escape. They emerged from the cave at the grassy base of the cliff. The sun stood at its zenith. Light clouds drifted lazily across the blue sky, and a nearby ancient forest rustled its leaves. "Thank the gods we're saved," Brutus exulted. Bess looked at the Romans and suddenly asked, "Where's Quintus?" The legionaries exchanged astonished glances, only now realizing their leader was missing. Brutus turned to Vitus. "You with your lame leg were the last. Did you see Quintus behind you?" "The last I saw him was in the hall, by the basin with black water," the Praetorian admitted. "I called to him, and he seemed to turn and run after me. But then, in the corridor, it was dark, and I was running without looking back, wanting to get out of that cursed place as quickly as possible so I didn't notice Quintus." "Damn it!" Brutus exclaimed. "We must find him." The Briton rushed back to the cave, but Bess grabbed his forearm. "Don't go there. You'll die for nothing," the Thracian said quietly. "When the gods shake the mountains, you must run as far from them as possible. Those who stay are their prey." Suddenly, a crash echoed from the cave, and a cloud of dust rose from its dark depths. "See, Brutus. That's a collapse. It's time for us to leave," Bess said. "To Pluto's backside." Brutus swore. "Losing a legate and a relative of Caesar himself. We can't return to Rome without him. The emperor will tear us to pieces." "There's nothing I can do," Bess replied grimly. "It seems Quintus chose his fate, trying to find something in that hall. I saw the madness in his eyes, Brutus." "You're right. It seems he really lost his mind," the Briton agreed. "At first I thought it was from their cursed potion. I managed to fool the savages by discreetly spitting out the drink, and I saw the others turning into vegetables before my eyes. But then, when the idol was defeated, there was really something wrong with Quintus. Well, at least we're alive, thanks to you. And we have a ship. But where is it? And how do we get to it?" Bess turned to Venari. "Do you know how to get to the lagoon on the southern shore, girl?" he asked. "Yes, I will guide you." "Oh gods, how do you know where the galley is, Thracian?" Brutus asked, wide-eyed. "From the winged giant, friend," Bess grinned. "You won't believe it, but he spoke to me." "Then why didn't I hear him?" "He spoke inside me." The barbarian's eyes gleamed. He stood with the Romans, swaying from exhaustion, covered in bloody marks, dust, and sweat, and laughed. The Briton looked at the Thracian as if he were possessed, but then laughed too. "Well, if that bloody monster said so, we should believe him." Venari interrupted. "The way south will be long. If the foreigners want to find the ship before sunset, we must hurry." She's not as foolish as she seems, Brutus noted. Let's go. The warriors followed the girl into the forest, glancing back at the mountains. The highest peak was smoking. Huge boulders tumbled down the slopes. So fall the ancient empires, Bess coldly observed. They are all destined to disappear from the face of the earth sooner or later. It's their fate. Rome, too, is doomed to fall. Don't compare this dark world with Rome, the aristocrat Valerius retorted, offended. It's not the same at all. They worship monstrous gods and spill human blood on their altars. We bring culture, civilization, and the light of knowledge to the world. And you spill blood in arenas, forcing some to kill each other, others, to be fed to wild beasts, not in the name of gods, but merely for your own entertainment, the barbarian said darkly. No, Rome is doomed too. And know this, if I live, I will be there when it falls. If death finds me sooner, then my spirit will watch from the realm of the dead to see the empire's end. The young native girl showed the foreigners the way to the lagoon, where in the blazing sunset light, the missing Roman galley rocked on the waves. Look there, the barbarian cheerfully called to his companions. The cursed demon didn't lie. The galley is there. If the rowers are still alive, then by the gods we have a crew to sail the seas and engage in your favorite activity, Brutus. Tell me, where are the slaves chained to the oars from? From various lands, the Briton smiled. There are Gauls and Jews, Cimbri and Iberians, your Thracian brothers, and even a couple of Latins sent to the galleys for debts. But I'd particularly note 2 Carthaginians, descendants of the founders of Carthage. They have sailing in their blood, so I think we'll manage to get the ship to open sea. While the Briton spoke, they reached the shore. The waves crashed against the nearby rocks and hissed as they rolled onto the sandy beach. The galley awaited its owners about a bowshot away, and the men began building a raft to reach the ship. They cleared the nearby trees of branches and tied them together with long vines. Soon the raft was ready, and the Romans climbed aboard without delay. However, the Thracian was in no hurry to join them. Standing on the shore, at the water's edge, Bess suddenly spoke to the girl. You said women can't appear in Bagel's temple, that he punishes those who disobey, but you entered there. While fighting the Black Colossus, I saw. No, I felt you there. Why did you risk intervening? I couldn't let you die, she replied, even if it meant dying myself. Bess gently took her chin. Venari, I know I owe you my life and would like to repay you, if there's any way to reward your actions. But more than anything, I don't want to part with you. By the gods, I've never met a girl more beautiful. Come with me, and you'll see the big world that Xenu and his followers hid from you. You'll wear Phoenician purple, drink Falernian wine and dine on Egyptian gold, see distant lands, beautiful cities with tall towers and white stone temples. I'll make sure you never regret leaving this island. Decide now. The girl looked down at her feet and answered vaguely. A warrior from the big world killed the earthly embodiment of the one who always returns. Xenu is dead. Balgor is dying. Then she looked up at the Thracian with wide eyes and said, I believe you, Bess. I don't know the paths of fate, but as long as my heart beats, know this. Venari will be happy to follow you wherever you go. Bess laughed joyously, wrapped her in a tight embrace, and did not let go until Brutus's irritated voice broke the moment. Hey, Thracian, are we going to raid Imperial ships, or should we leave you here? Bess reluctantly released Venari from his embrace and turned to the Romans, a determined glint in his eyes. He led the girl to the raft, and they both climbed aboard, joining the legionaries. The makeshift vessel wobbled as they paddled towards the galley, the setting sun casting long shadows across the water. as they approached the ship. The rowers, still chained but alert, began to murmur among themselves, recognizing the figures of their liberators. With renewed vigor, they helped pull the raft alongside the galley. Brutus was the first to clamber up the side, followed by Bess and the others. The slaves watched with a mixture of hope and uncertainty as the new arrivals cut their bonds. Bess stood at the helm, his powerful voice cutting through the evening air. "We sail for freedom and glory. No longer are we bound by the chains of tyranny and dark gods. Together we will carve our path across the seas, free men all." The men cheered, their spirits lifted by the promise of a new life. As the galley set sail, Venari stood beside Bess, her hand resting in his. They watched the island of Balgor shrink into the distance, the plume of smoke from the highest peak still visible against the darkening sky. "What's next for us, Bess?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "Adventure, battles, and perhaps even peace," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. "But most importantly, we'll face it together." As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, the galley sailed into the unknown, carrying with it the hope of a new beginning and the enduring spirit of those who dared to defy fate.